Well, unfortunately, a win wasn't to be had for the Bears, but it was very much a case of pride restored with a battling performance at home to the York City Knights. We're going to go over all of that now and get all the post-match reaction. This is the world's greatest podcast about the Coventry Bears. This is Bear Necessities. Yes, welcome to Bear Necessities, your podcast about Coventry Bears. I'm one of your hosts, Dave Musson. Joining me, as always, my co-host and former Bears player, Craig Cathcart. Craig, how are you doing?
Yes, I'm great, mate. I've thoroughly enjoyed the rugby today. Wasn't the result that we wanted, and the second half probably wasn't what we wanted either, but overall it's been a really good day.
Certainly has. So we have our base at covbearspodcast.com. We are at covbearspodcast on Twitter. We're sponsored by Bears Vice Presidents and by York's Tim. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, YouTube, all of the usual places. So do make sure you subscribe. Do make sure you tell a friend and help spread the word of our little show. So coming up on this week's show, we're going to tell you the story of the Bears' 58-18 defeat to the York City Knights. Don't be put off by the score. There's a lot more good stuff to be had. Don't be distracted by the numbers there. We'll get the post-match thoughts of Bears head coach Tom Tsang. We've got a question to ask Mr. C this week, and we're also going to play the interview we've been promising for a long time with Rugby League historian and fellow Rugby League podcaster Tony Collins, talking about the history of Rugby League in Coventry and the Midlands and what it might mean for the future. So do stick around for that. But let's get on to the story of the match first. So York City Knights were coming to Coventry, and as you probably know, they set that world record a couple of weeks ago against the West Wales Raiders, 144-0. They put on a show for BBC Sport cameras a couple of weeks before that in the Challenge Cup. They're very much in the mix for promotion. And after last week, it would have been easy to be worried about the Bears, but they put on a terrific show, and as said at the top of the show, restored a lot of pride in the jersey and in the team this year. That said, Bears did have a bit of a slow start. They found themselves 18-0 down within 12 minutes. But then that kind of sparked the comeback. So Jacob Ogden scored the Bears' first try on his home debut. York were showboating a little bit, forced one offload too many, ball went to ground. Jacob picked it up on halfway and sprinted in to score, and of course Benstead converted. And then on 23rd minute, Richie Hughes scored a try. The Bears had forced a repeat set close to the York line. Ben Gray was held up just short, but Richie was quick with the play of the ball. He touched down from dummy half. Conversion again good, took it back to 12-18. And then 3 minutes after that, Bears got field position with a brilliant 40-20 from Benstead, and eventually worked through the phases to set up a debut try for Peter Ryan, who scored under the post. Conversion was good again. That got it back to 18-all. And then potentially, and we'll discuss this later, potentially a match-changing moment. So Hayden Freeman had a try disallowed. He was given as offside, which looked ludicrous, to be fair. And a minute later, York scored their fourth try of the half. A desperately unlucky knock-on by Jason Bass right on the Bears line, and it was a very easy score for the Knights to finish and convert. So that made it 24-18 at half-time, but the Bears went off to a rousing reception, and there was a really, really good feeling around the ground. Unfortunately, as Craig alluded to at the start of the show, second half, York just kind of shut the game down and locked the Bears out, basically deprived them of any ball, and they put on 6 tries in the second half to take it to a final score of 50-18. But Bears didn't give up at all. They were big in defence all game. They looked decent in attack. And as we've said many times already in this episode, we've got that pride restored. So Craig and I will go through the game in a minute, but first, let's hear the post-match thoughts of Bears head coach Tom Tsang. So, Tom, not the win we would have wanted, but a bit of pride restored with that performance.
Yeah, it was a good reaction that first 40 minutes from last week. Obviously, it was the deepest of deep after the game last week, and we've done a lot of talking this week in training, a lot of soul searching, being very honest with ourselves and what we needed to do to improve. And a lot of the guys took some real accountability for their own performances, and we were all determined to put it right. And I think we showed what we are capable of for 40 minutes. For me, York are the best team in this division. I personally think they're a better team than Bradford. My personal opinion, and I think for me they're favourites to go up alongside Bradford. They're a championship-ready team right now. So for us to be able to match them for 40 minutes shows what we're capable of. And then it was a bit of combination, probably fatigue, naivety, and maybe just a dip in effort in some areas, off the ball efforts, that meant that York, their class shone through in the second half, and they obviously sort of kept the scoreboard ticking over and ended up running away with it. But it's a good response, it's a good reaction, but we can't be satisfied. We can't be happy with just that. We'll look again this week at what we need to do to keep improving, and we'll keep working hard.
A couple of players I wanted to pick out. Peter Ryan making his debut for the Bears today, and Jacob Ogden making his home debut. Both of them really seem to impress. How pleased were you with both of those guys?
Yeah, absolutely sensational from Peter. He picked up a knee injury in pre-season, which sort of probably set him back about 4 to 6 weeks. But he's been training well the last 2 weeks, and I had a conversation with him last week about where he was in the squad, and this week he's really stepped up again. So he deserved his opportunity, and I thought he was absolutely top class. He played the full 40 minutes against a York pack that have been dominating most teams, and he's absolutely stood up. He scored a try. He's put his body in front of some really big boys and dominated contacts. And then he came back on for the last 15 minutes as well. So he's putting a 60-minute performance at prop against a team that are dominating a lot of other teams. So he needs to be really proud of what he's done there. And it's just an example. He's now an example for the other props in the team of what's required, because they're all capable as well. Every player that we've got in that position in the club is capable of the same performance. So he's leading the way on that front right now. So very happy. Jacob as well, excellent in the centres. I thought him and Cameron and on either side of the field really helped us defensively. They talked a lot, and they're very athletic and able to fix things because of that. But yeah, it was a team performance today, the good and the bad, and that was probably the message out the back of last week. Is we when we win, it's as a team, and when we don't win, it's also as a team, and we just need to get around each other and help each other, and that's what we've done. So.
And Liam Rice Wilson in the halves as well today, put on a decent showing, I felt. Does he give you perhaps an extra option in the halves there that you might not necessarily have associated with him at the start of the season? Yeah,
he stepped in there twice before. Once when Ben said was away, and once when Paul was away against Hemel. So he has had a couple of games there, and I thought he was great. Did his job. Him and Steady worked well together. They've played together a lot at Gloucestershire University. And that's all he needed to do, and that's all we need to do as a team, was just get through our sets, play to the structures that we know, and we'll create opportunities. And we managed to finish 3 of them off. There was a couple that got chalked off as well. Yeah. So with the ball, I'm happy with what we're doing. Coming out of our end away from our try line, we were leaving York players on the floor. They play the ball quite a lot, and it was all about defence. So yeah, with the ball, I'm happy with what we're doing. And defensively, we took a big step forward. We still got a long way to go, but we're all going in the right direction now, which is like six days ago. Obviously, we didn't know where we were going to go from there, but I'm happy with it. We're now back travelling in the right direction.
Yeah. And just lastly, look ahead to next week. Workington Town coming to the Butts Park Arena. Obviously, last year's game against Workington was a bit of a heartbreaker. Are you looking forward to trying to set that right, and are you also looking forward to pitting your wits against Leon Price?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't want to just keep coming back to it, but because of what happened at Keighley, this week our preparation has all been focused on us. Yeah. We barely looked at York, in all honesty, and we'll probably do that again this week. We'll just look at ourselves and where we can improve ourselves, and if we do improve those little bits, then it will come naturally. The performance and potentially the result will come off the back of that. So we won't be thinking too much about the opposition, in all honesty. We'll just make sure that we're improving ourselves and working hard on that side of it, and see what happens.
Great. Tom, thanks always for your time.
No worries, thank you.
Okay, thanks to Bears head coach Tom Tsang there for his reaction to the match. So Craig, it's after last week kind of felt lowest of the low, and we said the second half was a bit of a difficult one to watch today, but that first half gives the Bears an awful lot to build on for the rest of the season.
Yeah, it was a great response, and particularly when you think that they went 18-0 down early on in the game, the heads could have dropped. York were really on it. They thought they were going to come here and score a hatful of tries, and the Bears fought back, and they fought really well. They fought, they ran hard, they tackled hard, they were creative when they had the ball, and in that first half, York actually, a couple of their tries were from Bears mistakes, which were probably preventable.
And there was a bit of that team spirit back in display that we'd seen at the start of the season, wasn't it?
Yeah, the Bears really fought hard in the first half. They really give York a good game, and you could really see the frustration in the York team that they came here and they probably expected to roll over the Bears team, but they were properly in a game at half time. In fact, I think probably the scoreline didn't really tell the tale of the first half. I think the Bears probably had the better of the large parts of the first half and should have gone in at least equal with York at half time. So, and I think the other thing as well is York were very slow coming out at half time. They clearly got a bit of a rollicking at half time, and as I said, you could hear them really frustrated behind the posts whenever the Bears scored as well. So the Bears really give it a good go and give them a proper game in the first half.
A couple of players I wanted to pick out. So Peter Ryan making his debut for the Bears today, capped it with a try. He put in an initial 50-minute stint and was terrific in defence and really good going forward. And Jacob Ogden as well, your first time seeing him. I know we mentioned on the podcast last week that when he got the ball last week, he looked dangerous, and he proved it again today, didn't he? Those two players both really impressed, I felt.
Yeah, I loved the way Peter he used his strength. He's actually not the biggest lad in the world, but when he got tackled and he took some absolutely big, massive hits in the first half, I have to say fair play to him for getting back up and playing the ball. But every time he took it in, he got up, played the ball quickly. He built momentum. He might not have made huge amounts of yards, but actually he kept the Bears ticking over. And considering it's the first game in League One, he really didn't look out of place. Defensively as well, he put in some massive hits.
Immense.
Really, really good. And Jacob Ogden as well. I mean, he looks really good. That side of the field that he's on looks really, really good now. And he really did play well. And he's another one. He used the ball well. He played the ball quickly. It was really, really good.
And I think another player I wanted to mention as well, perhaps it's gone slightly under the radar so far this year, Liam Rice-Wilson. He was playing in the halves today, but no Paul Emanuele in the team today. I felt he had a good impact on the game today. He had good energy levels. I thought his kicking game was pretty solid as well. And it gave Ben Stead a chance to show his leadership qualities as well. The two of them, I felt, worked well together, particularly in the first half.
They played really well in the first half together. They didn't get as many opportunities in the second half. The Bears got starved of possession in the second half, but he did really well and stepped up. I have to say, every player really in the first half put their bodies on the line and they give it a good go. They unfortunately just couldn't keep it up in the second half. I think a bit of fatigue set in the second half. York came out firing. I think they were genuinely thought we're properly in a game here, so we really need to step it up a couple of levels, and they did in the second half, to be fair. The Bears didn't get much. They didn't get much from the referee either in the second half. There was a lot of decisions that I think were, if I'm being fair to the referee, they were 50-50 decisions, but not many of the 50-50 decisions went towards the Bears.
Very diplomatic.
Yeah. And I think there was a few moments in the game where there was like potentially knock-ons and other things going on that the Bears could have capitalised on, but just weren't able to do so. And they threatened the York line a couple of times in the second half, but really didn't get as many opportunities as they did in the first.
No. And just to finish on the game, I think a quick word for the noise of the fans for this one. It was really encouraging to see the home crowd just get behind the team, and it made a difference, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the Bears got clapped off at half-time. You could really hear the crowd today. They really got behind the players. They could see the effort put in. And, it'd be great if we could get some wins on the board now. And I think this team are capable of getting them. But what the fans really want to see when the Bears are at home is that they put in a really good effort. They put their bodies on the line. They put some hits in. They take it up and they give the opposition a good go. Let's not forget, York had a world record score 2 weeks ago. They're equal top of the league. They are packed full of players who have Championship and Super League experience. They are well drilled. They are very likely to get promotion at the end of this season, and they've been steamrolling a lot of teams in the division. So, this was a really good performance. As I said, in the first half from the Bears, they ran out of steam a little bit in the second half and couldn't quite cope with what York threw at them in the second half. But overall, I'm pleased that the Bears put last week behind them. I think they can take some pride. I think actually the scoreline today didn't absolutely reflect the game. I think it could have been close to the Bears. Could have had a couple of other tries. They had 2 tries disallowed in the first half. I think they had 1 in the second half, which they probably should have had as well. And they were through in the second half and probably should have scored as well. So it's one of those days where they give a good go and they give a good performance, and the fans really appreciated that. Yep,
much better stuff, and properly moved on from what happened last week. So, still to come in this episode, we've got our interview with Tony Collins. We'll have a quick look ahead to next week's game, home to Workington. But first, it's time for Ask Mr. C. So Ask Mr. C is a part of the show where I put your questions to my co-host. This part of the show is sponsored by York's Tim, for which we're very grateful. If you've got your own question, use the contact form at covbearspodcast.com or tweet it to @covbearspodcast using the hashtag Mr. C. Only one for you this week, Craig, and it comes from our sponsor, so you've got to answer it. York's Tim says, I've stolen this question from another rugby league blog, but I'd like to ask Mr. C if we blame referees too much for our club's on-field woes. We do like to moan from the sidelines, of course, but he wants to know how players see it.
It's a very apt question, because I think the last 2 home games we try not to moan about the referees, but the last 2 home games we've kind of felt that
dodgy refs.
Yeah, that we felt that the decisions haven't really gone our way. I think particularly the Scholars game, the ref and some of the decisions had an impact on the final result. Today, not so much, but again, we were sat here a couple of decisions thinking, why is he giving that call? There was a lot of 50-50s that didn't go the Bears' way. So I think it's probably easy to blame the referee when you don't get the result that you want. Mm-hmm. And I think players do have some responsibility, and fans do as well. Obviously there's a home advantage. The fans try and put some pressure on the referees, but it's not an easy job. It really isn't. And I mean, particularly at this level, this is the 3rd level of rugby league, and the guys that go out there to officiate, they probably travel long distances. They're away from their family and so on. So it's not an easy job for them, but they have to be consistent. That's the main thing. And what the fans don't like to see is inconsistency. If a ref is consistent with decisions for both sides, then great. I think for someone like the Bear, for fans of the Bears, it's a bit frustrating, because a lot of the teams that the Bears play against are very experienced. They know how to play the referee. They know how to get decisions. And that's something we see creeping into the game now. In Super League, it's rife, and it's creeping into Championship and League One as well, where players are trying to win decisions from the ref, particularly around the play of the ball. They're trying to get penalties, and it's working. And the refs need to be stronger. They need to not be influenced by the teams on the pitch. Perhaps the Bears need to be a bit smarter. They need to play the referee as well, and play things like the offside decisions. The Bears had, I don't know how many offside decisions given today against them. York were stood offside today as well, but had less decisions around the play of the ball and holding down and everything else. The Bears had more decisions given against them. I guess you could probably say York were smarter, but they're probably more experienced. They know what they can get away with around the play of the ball. So it's a bit of both. In terms of players, I mean, when I was playing, the referee can have a massive impact on the game, especially in close games where it could go either way. One bad decision from a referee can completely turn the game. I think we saw in the Scholars game, there was a point in the game where the Bears were completely on top and the ref didn't give a decision where there was a clear swinging arm that everyone in the whole stadium saw, and didn't give the decision for the Bears, and Scholars went on to score from the next set. And that, it's things like that can completely change the game. So I would just like to see more consistency. The other thing as well, without rambling on too much about this, but there was decisions today that the referee, there were 50-50 decisions the referee had to make. And I have to say, he had no help from his linesmen at times. You have to have that help. There was a point in the game where it was a clear knock-on from a York player. He lost the ball. It rolled around his back and he managed to catch it again. And the linesman was stood right next to it and didn't give the decision. The referee copped all the flack, but he wouldn't have been able to spot it. The linesman was right there. He should have called it. So you want to see the linesmen helping out as well. I mean, I think overall, the referees need more support. And once they get more consistency in the decisions that they make, the fans, hopefully, fingers crossed, will back off a little bit.
Yeah, certainly will. So don't forget, if you've got a question you want to ask Mr. C on a future episode, then do get in touch, covbearspodcast.com, and use the contact form, or tweet us a question to @covbearspodcast using the hashtag AskMrC. So we'll have a quick look ahead to next week's game at home to Workington. But first, we're going to play our long-promised interview with rugby league historian, fellow podcaster Tony Collins. So this is a chat about the history of the sport in the Midlands and in Coventry in particular, which Tony describes as one of the great what ifs of the sport. So we have a bit of a chat about the influence of Super League as well, and the place of the Bears within the growth of rugby league. So it's an interesting chat for all you history buffs out there, and for you just fans of the Bears in general. So have a listen to that, and we'll be back right afterwards. So Tony, welcome to Bare Necessities. It's really great to have you on the show. Are you well? How are you today?
I'm doing great, thanks. And it's great to be on Bare Necessities. I think the podcast is the Rugby League podcasting fraternity is growing really quickly, and it's a really excellent way of getting fans and everybody else discussing the game and taking outside of the hands of the usual suspects in journalism. Yeah, definitely. And I mean, you're a fellow Rugby League podcaster as well, aren't you? I was going to plug it at the end of the interview, but we may as well mention it now. You did the Rugby Reloaded podcast, which is kind of history of the game in 10-minute bites. So how are you finding that? Are you enjoying doing that as a show? Yeah, well, I think I'm up to number 8 now, so I'm kind of a newbie at it. And I thought also I'd just keep it to a short 10 minutes because there's only so much of a Hull accent you can bear at any one go. But no, it's been a fantastic response. Obviously from Rugby League supporters, but also from Rugby Union supporters. So I've been really chuffed. And I think it's a great way of getting history out there. Just short 10-minute bursts, but there's so much you can say in that amount of time. So yeah, I'm really pleased at the way it's been going. So some people listening to this might either recognise your voice or recognise your name or both. So can you just give a quick summary as to what you actually do? Oh, right. I'm actually, my day job is Professor of History at De Montfort University's International Centre for Sports History. I've been there for since 2011 now. So I do that. And I write a lot of academic history about rugby league, but also about rugby union and football in general. I've got a book on the origins of all the different football codes coming out in September, called How Football Began. So hopefully it does what it says on the tin. But I also do a lot of work with Rugby League Cares, the Rugby League charity, on their heritage projects, and particularly at the moment we're working on a project with Bradford City Council to develop a national Rugby League museum in Bradford's iconic Victorian Town Hall. We've just put in in collaboration with Bradford City Council, we've just put in a bid to the Heritage Lottery Fund. So hopefully we'll hear something back from them towards the end of the year about whether our bid's been successful or not.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's we're one of the few national sports without a national museum, and as I think most people in the game know, rugby league history is particularly fascinating because of the nature of its birth and how it's how it developed out of the industrial north in the 19th century. So there's a great story to tell, and not just in this country. Obviously, the story, what happened to rugby league in France, the expansion to Australia, New Zealand, things like that. They're fantastic stories to tell. So, and there's, they deserve a national museum as a platform to tell those stories.
So the reason we're chatting on this podcast is to talk about rugby league in the Midlands and Coventry in particular. So, I mean, a lot of our listeners will be aware that there was a team in Coventry before the First World War, and the current Bears squad is actually paying tribute to them this season with a special black and white kit as part of the current Bears 20th anniversary. But I know when I mentioned it to you when we were setting this chat up, you called Coventry's old Northern Union side one of the great what ifs of the sport. So what did you mean by that, and why is it such an interesting one?
Because one of the interesting things I think that happened in general with rugby in the 19th century is that it's not really appreciated because of what happened to the game after. Is that in many places rugby was the first mass spectator sport over and above football, and you can see. You can see in Yorkshire and Lancashire where teams have been around since the 1860s. And certainly in West Yorkshire, they predate soccer clubs by 30 years. I mean, Leeds United and Hull City only came into the Football League in 1905, which is like 40 years after the first rugby clubs have been formed in those cities. And in a sense, it's very similar in the West Midlands. In the Midlands, East and West Midlands, because you have a situation where Coventry Rugby Union Club was formed almost a decade before Coventry City Football Club. Similar in Leicester, what became Leicester Tigers were formed a long time before Leicester Foss, Northampton, again, same trend. And the game quickly became a mass spectator sport and involved all classes of society, from factory workers all the way up to the privately educated captains of industry and local politicians. And so it's the kind of social conditions that you had for rugby, that rugby grew up in Coventry, Leicester and Northampton, were actually very similar to what happened in the north of England with the Northern Union. So in a sense, it's not surprising that Northern Union did get a toehold in Coventry in the years before the First World War. And so it's when you consider that, how that developed and how it didn't develop, that you can see that really what happened in Coventry is part of the same process that led to the split in 1895 in the north, but it just never reached that critical mass for it to become the code of rugby in Coventry.
Do you think it was just a case of the team wasn't able to survive for long enough to get that foothold, to get that critical mass, or was it more to do with the fact that the union clubs were perhaps not as supportive as they might have been of it?
I think it's probably a bit of both, because after the split took place in 1895, one of the things that the Rugby Football Union did was to be slightly less confrontational when it came to confronting cases of payment to players and suspected professionalism. And so most famously in Wales, the former Welsh captain Arthur Gould in 1896 was given a benefit, a testimonial by the Welsh Rugby Union completely against the rules of rugby union, and there was it looked for a while that Wales would be expelled, and if the RFU had acted in accordance with its principles as it did in the north of England, then Wales would have been expelled. But they realised that would be too much of a blow to their authority and damage international rugby, so they stepped back. The term used was a question of expediency, and the same thing happened in the Midlands as well. Leicester were notorious for paying players. And in fact, Leicester was so notorious they poached players from the northern clubs. If you go to Welford Road and you go into the main reception, there's a picture of Edward Redmond, who was one of the all-time greats of the Tigers, but it doesn't mention the fact that he actually played for Manningham, the original champions of the Northern Union, and left Manningham in 1893 because Leicester offered him the tenancy of a pub and no doubt other rewards for doing so. And that continued into the early 1900s, and Leicester were investigated for suspected professionalism. And quite bizarrely, the RFU found them not guilty, despite the fact they were, contrary to the rules of the game, playing ex-Northern Union players. And the RFU insisted that 4 Leicester players had to pay money back to the club that they'd been paid. So the RFU compromised. And in Coventry, a similar thing happened because the Coventry Rugby Union were investigated for payments to players in 1909. They were suspended, and a significant portion of the club members wanted to go over to the Northern Union. And just at the point that this was gathering momentum, the RFU decided to lift the ban and allow the club back in to play its fixtures against other rugby union clubs, which obviously derailed the prospects for Northern Union, quite deliberately derailed the prospects for Northern Union at that point. So the Coventry Northern Union wasn't as strong as what it would have hoped it would have been. And I think the other thing it's difficult to appreciate to some extent in these days of easy travel and the internet and motorway links and all the rest of it, is that it was actually quite difficult to get from Coventry to play clubs in the north of England in those days. There was only, you had to rely on trains, and it would take something, if the club were playing in Hull against one of the Hull clubs, they'd leave at 7:30 and not return in the morning, and not return until 3:15 the following morning. So that all presented problems, which was, and again, the attempts to start the game, the splits that took place in rugby union in the southwest, in Devon, in the same period, just before the First World War, and then slightly earlier in Wales, had exactly the same problems, that logistical problems playing the northern clubs, and problems of the RFU backtracking and manoeuvring against the Northern Union clubs. And of course, the other big problem was that the best rugby players in Coventry who wanted to play Northern Union would be poached by the clubs in the north, who were much richer and could offer jobs and so on and so forth. So it was always a very difficult situation for the club to survive. And once World War I broke out in 1914, a couple of years after, 18 months after the club folded, it kind of sealed off any other potential developments after that. So basically what the template of British sport and rugby was set by August 1914.
Well, I was going to ask actually about the period after, sort of between the world wars. Like, do you think if Coventry had been able to sort of get the band back together, as it were, do you think they might have had a better shot? Was that period particularly crucial for how the sport has sort of developed since then, or was it, as you say, it was sort of done and dusted by the time the First World War came in?
The war changed a lot because rugby union emerged in the decade before, the decade between the 1895 split and the outbreak of the 20 years until the outbreak of World War I. Rugby union was in deep crisis, and in Britain, obviously, because of the split, then Coventry split, South West Wales, but also internationally as well, with Australia and New Zealand coming over to the game, to the Northern Union. But rugby union emerged from the war much stronger because it was so closely associated with patriotism, and the deaths of its players were seen as sacrifices that demonstrated the true value of rugby union. So it emerged with enormous authority, and that was very difficult to overcome, not just for the Northern Union, but also for soccer, because lots and lots of grammar schools, private schools who had previously played soccer before the First World War went over to play rugby union. And so once the war certainly once the war's over, it's pretty much impossible for rugby. It's pretty much impossible for those type of splits and fissures and cracks in rugby union that existed before the war to appear. And in fact, I only know, and I could be wrong on this, but I only know of one actual rugby union club who came over to rugby league in the 1920s, which was a club in Sheffield Hornets. Okay. Which I think shows the magnitude of the problem.
Yeah. So then, I mean, in terms of history of the sport in Coventry, we then sort of have to jump forward quite a long way to 1998 and the formation of the Bears. I mean, that feels like that must be an interesting point in the sport's history as well, because it's a couple of years after the launch of Super League. It's not long after Union had gone pro. Was that an interesting time for the game in terms of growth and new teams and new opportunities?
Absolutely. I think it's very interesting what happened immediately after the kind of big bang for both League and Union in 95, 96, that obviously they were both games had tremendous opportunities and tremendous difficulties at that point. And for League, I mean, I remember talking to one or two people who thought, oh, it's the end for rugby league because now Union's gone professional. They'll just take all our players and our top clubs will go over and play Union, which obviously in hindsight seems ridiculous, but things are in such a state of flux and uncertainty. And in a sense, the creation of the Bears and the other clubs who later joined the conference divisions was actually a symbol of how much rugby league could gain from this situation. Sure, rugby union now had a lot more money and was more attractive to play in terms of building a career, which only League could only offer payments before. But on the other hand, the fact that the union had gone professional meant that there was now no bar on union players trying their hand at League, and I think Coventry is one of the great examples of where that's proven to be it's proven to be a success. Because again, it's difficult to imagine now, but in the 100 years before 1995, players weren't allowed to try their hand. Rugby union players weren't allowed to try their hand at rugby league because if they were caught doing so, they'd be banned for life. Yeah. So I think the Bears are a great example of how the rugby world in its broadest sense has changed and offered new opportunities for rugby league.
And I guess the Bears have obviously made it 20 years so far, so they're having a better stab at it than that original Northern Union side. Do you think how important do you think the Bears might be for the next generation of the game's historians and scholars? Do you think the formation of the Bears and the way they're going at the moment could be another interesting chapter in the history of the sport?
Yeah, definitely, because I think they're an example of the way in which the game has expanded over the last 23 years. I think rugby league supporters are often very pessimistic and sort of overly. They always think the game is on the brink of doom. It's a bit like. It's a bit like the guy in Dad's Army. We're all doomed. We're doomed. But the Bears and a lot of other examples around the country demonstrate that, in fact, rugby league has expanded geographically in incredible ways over the last 20 odd years, both in Britain and internationally. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the 1972 World Cup when there were just five teams playing. Was it five or four? 4 teams playing. Sorry, yeah. And if you might occasionally get an amateur team from London that had been set up by some northern expats playing, in the Southern Amateur League or something like that. Whereas now it's fantastically, it's unremarkable that the Bears are playing, in the Challenge Cup, that they're in the third tier of the league structure. So I think that shows how far the game has come, and I think that's important to remember, considering that we do have this tendency to we are a glass half empty type of game.
Yeah. So does the prospect of expansion and seeing the game in Coventry, Toronto, Toulouse, potentially New York, and all of these other places, does that excite you as a scholar of the game?
Oh, well, it certainly excites me as a fan of the game. I've always been a keen expansionist.
Yeah.
And as a historian, I think it's very interesting because it's one of the things that always happens is that it's easy to fans of all sports like this. It's easy to exaggerate the successes and the expansion of your own sport. Everybody thinks their sport's going to be big in China or big wherever you want, and these things don't often happen. But I think when we look at the way that rugby league has expanded in Britain over the last 25 years, then there were some really well-established success stories that obviously have real roots in the community, and they're not just teams that have been set up by a few friends and that fold as soon as someone moves away. These are clubs that have real structures, have dug deep roots in their communities, and have a real culture that that demonstrates that the game means things to people in just the same way outside of, I don't want to use the word heartlands, but outside of the better known rugby league areas, just as much as they do, in Wigan or Leeds or Hull.
Yeah, and so I guess as a way of closing off, I mean, a lot of times people will look through events of history and sort of try and figure out what lessons can be learned from the past to help inform the future. So what do you think the Bears and other expansion clubs have to do to ensure history doesn't repeat itself? I mean, it feels like they're in a much better place than that Northern Union team before the First World War was. But is there anything that you've picked up on that you think clubs need to be wary of or conscious of or anything like that?
I think the most important thing is the thing that really started the game off in the 1870s and 1880s, and it's fostering a sense of local identity, of becoming a symbol of local pride. And I think that's the most important thing. Because sport's about much more than just sport. It's about more than what's played on the pitch, and it's not, by and large, and although rugby league fans, another trait of rugby league fans is that we think our game is the most attractive, the best way to play an oval ball code of football, which obviously I think is true. But for most people, or outside of people like me and you, it requires something else. It's got to mean something to their lives. It's got to help them make sense of the world, or represent themselves in the world, or make them feel good about their place in the world. And that comes down to locality. If you can see the representatives of your town or your street or your area in action, fighting for the honour and the pride of the locality against somebody else, that's when people buy into it. That's when people think, well, this is an important part of where I live and who I am. And if a club can foster, the more a club can do to foster that, the longer its life will be, I think.
Mm-hmm. Great stuff. Well, Tony, this has been fascinating to chat through all of this kind of thing. Really appreciate your time. Just before you go, if people want to find out more about you and the book you've got coming out and the podcast, where can they do all of that?
Oh, great, thanks. Well, you can go to my website, which is www.rugbyreloaded.com. That's all one word. The Rugby Reloaded podcast is on SoundCloud and iTunes. Just search for Rugby Reloaded. And if you're that interested, you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Collins Tony. Basically my name reversed in one word. So yeah, and if you've got anything to say about anything, then I'm always happy to hear from you.
Great stuff. Well, thanks ever so much, Tony. And if you ever fancy coming to watch a game at the Butts Park Arena this season, just let us know. It'd be great to meet up. Definitely,
I'll take you up on that. Yeah, because of course that's where the original Northern Union club played as well. So
well, yes.
It's you're standing on living history when you go and watch the team.
Indeed, we are. Well, yeah, great stuff. Hopefully, see you at a game sometime.
Yeah, definitely. Cheers, Dave. Thanks ever so much.
So that was our chat with Tony Collins. Don't forget, go and follow him at Collins Tony on Twitter and look out for his book, How Football Began, which is coming out in September. Craig, I don't want to dissect the interview too much because we're probably due about time to wrap up, but really interesting chat with Tony, and particularly what he ended on there, talking about what the Bears need to do for the future and about fostering that sense of local identity and becoming a symbol of local pride. That feels like what the Bears are trying to do already this season, so it bodes well, doesn't it?
Yeah, that was a fascinating interview. I really loved listening to that. I think it's a brilliant point to make, actually. I think you can talk about results on the pitch, you can talk about everything else going on at a club, but what people really identify with is local heroes, players that are based locally that they can relate to. Mm-hmm. This Bears team have got tons of locally based players. What they probably really need is a superstar to come through who's from Coventry, who can drive them forward, someone who can be a talisman for the club and really push things forward. And the fans will get behind that. I think it doesn't really matter what the results are on the pitch if they can see players with real skill and ability who are locally based, giving it large to the teams up north and really giving it a good go.
Yeah. So good stuff, yeah. And of course, brilliant chance to remind you all of the Bears junior training that's running. If your kids are interested in rugby league and fancy being that Bears superstar of the future that we're all waiting for, then make sure you check out the Bears junior training as well on a Friday night. So we're almost done for this week's episode, but not before we have a quick look ahead to next weekend's game at home to Workington Town. So Craig, the game at home to Workington last year was the game that made
many... Can you
not
even mention it, please?
But it confirmed many Bears fans that they were fans of the Bears, because to watch that game, to watch them lose by a point, having fought back so valiantly, was a real emotional roller coaster. We don't know what Workington are going to be like because they don't seem to know themselves what team's going to turn up each week. They've got Leon Price at the helm coaching this year. They've got a couple of big names from his contacts book in. What do you reckon? Looking forward to it?
They've, as you said, I have no idea what Workington team's going to turn up. And I think, in all honesty, they're similar to last year. They had some results last year where they had unexpected wins against some of the higher teams in the league. And then they had some poor results against teams they should have beaten. This year, they've been really up and down. They've had some fantastic results. And then the next week followed it up with a really poor performance. So I really don't know what team's going to turn up. What I do know is the Bears really pushed them hard last year and probably should have won the game, but it was one of the performances of the season last year, despite the result.
Certainly was.
And actually, I think it was one of the ones that spurred us into trying to get the podcast set up.
Yes,
so
very much.
It was the birth of Bear Necessities, so to speak. But it was. I think the Bears need to show some of the fight that they showed from the first half today. They need to not pay Workington too much respect and actually just give it a good go. And I think they can push them really hard. Workington will come here. That again, like York today, they've got players with Super League and Championship experience. They got players who have played rugby league all their lives. So the Bears really will be up against it. But I have belief in this squad. I believe that there will be one or two results this year where the Bears are going to get the win against one of the more established teams, and this could be one of those games.
Yep, and we'll be there to see it, and you should be there as well. Butts Park Arena next Sunday, the 20th of May, kickoff 3 p.m. All the usual rundown of match day at Butts Park Arena. 12:30 gates open. Come in, get a drink, come and watch some good rugby league, and then listen to our podcast afterwards. You can find all of our episodes at covbearspodcast.com. We're at Covbears Podcast on Twitter. Subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, YouTube, wherever you get your audio from. Tell a friend, and that would be mega, mega helpful. Craig, see you next week.
Thanks, mate. Yeah, looking forward to it.